Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. My guest today says that the state of the Indian economy is considerably worse than the government admits and probably much worse than most people realize. In fact, when you hear his views, chances are you'll be pretty shocked. He is, of course, the Malcolm S. Adiseshiah Professor at the Institute of Social Studies and the author of a recently published book, and here it is, it's called The Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis. He is, of course, Professor Arun Kumar. Professor Arun Kumar, I want to focus today on the state of the economy as we approach the budget in 2 days' time on Monday. You believe the state of the economy is much worse than the government has admitted, than probably anyone realizes. Now, yesterday, Friday, when the government released the economic survey, it forecast that for the year as a whole, the economy would shrink by 7.7%. You believe that is going to shrink by an astonishing 29%.
Right.
That's almost 4 times worse. Are you absolutely sure of that 29% figure?
Yes, Karan, thanks for having me here. The state of the economy is rather poor because what does a lockdown mean? It means voluntarily shutting down economic activity. People don't go out to work, people don't go to factories and to, the offices, so you found roads were empty, the environment became much cleaner. You had pictures, from Jalandhar seeing the Himalayas, from Siliguri seeing the Kanchenjunga.
All of that I accept, and all of that we know. But do you really believe that this is going to result in a drop of 29% over the year as a whole? Not just one quarter, but the whole year.
Correct. So, when you have a lockdown, it means only essentials are produced. And that's less than 25% of the GDP. So you had minus 75% in April. And during lockdown, you had a little bit of improvement in May, but basically still 70% down. So you're coming from minus 75% up. And the government doesn't admit to that. So when you come up, and the government's estimate is that in Q3 and Q4, you'd have, roughly where you were back earlier in 2019. My estimate is still it's down by at least 10% now in January, So from minus 75% when you are coming up and it takes a year to come up back to where you were, you're going to have minus 29%.
Let me just pick up on some of those points you made because I think it's important for the audience to understand them. You're saying that in April, the economy shrank by 75%.
Yes.
That is the very first month of lockdown.
Correct.
And you believe that from that point, it is still, in January, minus 10% down.
Correct.
So in quarter 3, when the government says, in fact, we're going to see 0.1% growth, you're actually saying, no, we're going to see the economy shrink by 10% in quarter 3.
Yeah. And quarter 4, because we are now in quarter 4 in January.
How much will quarter 4 shrink?
So quarter 4 will shrink by something around 10% or so.
So both quarter 3 and quarter 4
will
are
be
10% down each?
Yes, because services sector is not revived, major components of the economy have not revived, and above all, the unorganized sector, which is the big elephant in the room, that has not revived.
Your whole argument hinges on the claim that in April the economy shrank by 75%. And I think that's buttressed by your fact that only 25% of essential services were being produced. Hence, 75% is the shrinkage.
Right.
How sure and confident are you of this figure? Where does it come from?
So this is, in my book, I have shown what are the sectors which could work, what are the sectors which couldn't work in the month of June, and then in the month of, April, and then in the month of September. So my thing is based on an analysis of sector by sector, what can work and what can't work.
And you believe going sector by sector, in April, the first month after the lockdown, only 25% of the economy was functioning.
That's right.
In other words, 75% is the shrinkage in the economy in the first month of the lockdown.
Yes.
Let me put this to you. I've heard you. You've explained how you come to your minus 29% figure for the year as a whole. I should point out that the worst estimate of shrinkage that I know of is the IMF, who forecasts that the Indian economy over the year will shrink by 10.3%. You're even 3 times worse than the IMF.
Correct.
And you're 4 times worse than the government.
Correct. The reason is that you see the unorganized sector is not taken into account in our quarterly data. And at the moment, we are only discussing the quarterly data. Okay? And IMF is not a data collecting agency, so it simply takes the government's data and reanalyzes it. It doesn't do a reanalysis. So whether it be IMF or World Bank or ADB or other agencies, they don't collect the data.
I completely accept your point. The IMF simply reanalyzes government data.
That's
they
right.
don't have data of their own. So let's leave the IMF out of the picture.
Correct.
The real dispute, if I can use that language, is between you and the government.
Yes.
The government has, in the economic survey of yesterday, said the economy over the year will shrink by 7.7%.
Correct.
You are saying to me today, and you stand by this,
Right.
that actually over the year the economy will shrink by 29%.
Correct.
In other words, the economy's shrinkage will be 4 times greater than what the government has said.
Absolutely.
You stand by that?
Yes, I stand by that. And the reason is very simply because the government has not taken into account the unorganized sector, hasn't taken into account the actual shrinkage in the month of April, May.
Let's then at this point come to the many reasons you have for believing that the state of the economy is much worse
Right.
compared to what the government believes.
Yes.
One reason is, of course, that the government hasn't adequately understood and recognized what's happened to the unorganized sector.
Right.
And I'll come to that in a moment's time.
Sure.
But actually, you have other reasons as well. You begin by pointing out that the data on the basis of which the government usually forecasts Q1 and Q2
Right.
was not available to the government.
Correct.
They used other data sources instead,
Yes.
which the government itself accepts
Right.
were A, clearly limited,
Yes.
and B, will undergo revision.
Absolutely.
So for those 2 quarters, Q1 and Q2, how unreliable is the data the government used?
So, this is the PIB's note, on the Q1 and Q2. And this says data was not available, so we are using alternate data. What it means is that the usual methodology that is followed was not followed. Second is whenever there's a shock, then the unorganized sector doesn't behave like the organized sector, whereas the data that's available to the government is only the organized sector except for agriculture. And agriculture is 14% of GDP. Rest of the unorganized sector, which is 31%, for that the data is not available.
So when we talk about the government's figures for Q1 and Q2, the government predicted a decline of 23.9% in Q1, roughly just over 7%, 7.5, 7.6 for Q2. You're saying this was based upon unreliable data.
Yes.
You're also saying that the truth is that the shrinkage both in Q1 and Q2 would be greater than 23.9 in Q1
Right.
and greater than 7.4 or 5 in Q2.
Yes. So I have estimated that in Q1 it would be roughly minus 50%. Minus 50%, because you're starting with minus 75, then going to minus 70, then going to maybe 40% or therefore. And in the Q2, it would be minus 25%.
So compared to 23.9 for Q1 from the
Yes.
government and 7.5 or 7.6 for Q2 from
Yes.
the government, you're saying Q1 is minus 50%
yes.
and Q2 is minus 25%.
Right.
Again, a huge order of difference.
Yes.
Huge order of difference between you and the government.
Correct. And what the government is doing is it's saying that we are using high frequency data. Now, high frequency data that they're using in the PIB note is mostly from the organized sector. Again, proving that the unorganized sector data is not there.
I'll come to this problem with the unorganized sector in a moment's time. But you make one more point first about Q1 and Q2 in terms of the data the government has used.
Yes.
This is not the normal data the government uses. This is new data they
Correct.
were forced to use because they didn't have the
data.
normal
That's
data.
right.
You say as a result, the data for Q1 is not comparable to the data for Q2. You also say the data for Q1 and Q2 for this year is not comparable to the data for Q1 and Q2 for last year.
That's right. That's right.
How much of a problem is created by this lack of comparability?
See, when you use different bases, then their data is not comparable. For Q1 of this year, the database was very different from what it was last year, and therefore you cannot compare the two. Okay.
So when the government claims that Q1 is 23.9% down,
Right.
actually they're not comparing similar databases, which is why that comparison is false.
Is false.
But that also means this is the basis of which you say it's not 23.9,
Correct.
it's actually minus 50% for Q1.
Correct.
I'm going to quote what you say.
Yes.
You say the shortcomings in the data cannot be rectified later,
Yes.
since if the data were not available or not collected, they cannot be obtained later. So there cannot be certainty about the speed of economic recovery. In other words, the guesstimate on
Yes.
which the government estimated Q1 and Q2 remains a guesstimate.
Yes.
It can never be improved upon.
Yes.
And secondly, the belief that there's a speed of recovery between Q1 and Q2 is another guesstimate, nothing more.
Absolutely right. Because when you don't have comparable databases, then it's like comparing oranges to apples. So compared to last year and for Q1 compared to Q2, it's like comparing oranges and apples. So these will not stand unless you bring in other bases which are available, and the government is not doing that.
This is the critical point you're making about the government's figures for Q1 and Q2, that the data the government has used to estimate Q1 this year and to estimate Q2 this year is substantially different to the data it used last year.
Yes.
When it was estimating Q1 and Q2,
Correct.
which is why this Q1 can't compare with last Q1.
That's right.
And this Q2 can't compare with last Q2.
Yes.
Which is why also that 23.9% figure for Q1 and 7.5 or 6 for Q2 doesn't hold up.
Yes.
And this is your grounds for saying actually the economy shrank by 50% in Q1, 25% in Q2.
Correct. And the government itself says that we are likely to revise the data. But how will they revise the data? Because they didn't collect the data. And if they didn't collect the data, how will you get the data later on? You needed to do surveys at that point of time when the economy was shrinking. Same problem took place during demonetization when the data was not available.
And because the government didn't collect the data earlier, because it's dealing with new data which is never used before,
Yes.
what is a guesstimate will remain a guesstimate.
Absolutely right.
It can never be improved upon.
Absolutely right.
And that's why any sense of the speed of recovery based upon two guesstimates
Yes.
is itself a guesstimate.
And a questionable.
And questionable.
And questionable.
Let's now come to that problem you've been hinting at many, many times, the manner in which the government estimates what's happening in the unorganized sector.
Yes.
And again, I'm going to go a little back in the story because I think it's important to understand that this is a problem that's been around for quite a while.
Quite.
And you admit that?
Yes.
That it's an old problem which has been exacerbated first by demonetization, then by GST,
Yes.
and finally, most recently, by the impact of the lockdown.
Yes.
And again, I want to quote you.
Yes.
You say, almost no data from the unorganized sectors, except for agriculture, are available to calculate the contribution of the unorganized sector to GDP. Now, what the government has traditionally done is to estimate the performance of the unorganized sector by using the organized sector as a proxy.
Correct.
And you said, anyway, this was an unsatisfactory way of doing it. It was based upon a false assumption.
Right.
But even this unsatisfactory way of doing it was made worse first by demonetization and then by GST.
Correct.
Can you start by explaining how demonetization and GST made worse the government's procedure for calculating what's happening in the unorganized sector?
So, demonetization impacted the unorganized sector unequivocally because it works in cash. Organized sector can work with bank accounts and various things, but not the unorganized sector. So as soon as cash shortage took place, the unorganized sector collapsed. GST exempted the unorganized sector, but it actually set back the unorganized sector because the organized sector was favored by the GST. So therefore, demand shifted from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. And I'll only quote the pressure cooker industry chairperson, Mr. Jagannathan from Prestige Pressure Cooker. And he said, after the GST was levied, that we are growing at 24% because the unorganized sector is declining.
This is a very important point. Let me just sum it up. First of all, you're saying what demonetization did was to suck cash out of the system. The unorganized sector is much more dependent on cash than the organized sector,
Yes.
which is why the unorganized sector suffered more than the organized sector.
Yes.
And what happened under GST is that demand shifted from the unorganized sector to the organized sector. And as this gentleman who you've quoted says, sectors like Prestige cookers grew 24% at the cost of the unorganized sector, which declined.
That's right.
In fact, you make this point very cleverly and clearly. You say, after demonetization and GST, and I'm quoting you, the higher growth rate of the economy actually masks the decline in the unorganized sector.
Absolutely right.
Which means the more the economy as a whole grew, the more the unorganized sector actually declined.
Was contracting, yes.
So two things were happening which are pretty contradictory.
That's right.
But they are the truth.
Yes.
One, after demonetization and GST, as the economy as a whole seemed to be growing, the unorganized sector actually was declining.
Yes.
And that's why you say the growth of the economy as a whole masked the decline of the unorganized sector.
Correct, absolutely right. And I'll quote to the All India Manufacturers Organization survey that came out at that time. It said, including a large number of micro, small and medium enterprises, showed job losses across sectors between 24% and 43%, and profits falling by 24% and 70%, And similarly, this June, they've again come out and saying that MSME, at least 1/3 are shutting shop, and saying that 72% of MSME responded saying that they are going to cut the employment.
Absolutely. You've now come into the third problem, which is linked to the first two. The first two is that demonetization and GST had a particularly sharp effect
Absolutely.
on the way we calculate what's happening in the unorganized sector.
Right.
It was anyway unreliable. Demon and GST made it even more unreliable.
Yes.
Now you're saying the lockdown added to this unreliability.
Yes.
Your words are, the lockdown has aggravated the tendency of overestimation of GDP. This is not captured in official data.
Yes.
In other words, the lockdown made the disjuncture between the economy as a whole and the unorganized sector even bigger.
Even bigger. And to give you an example, take agriculture, which is the one sector government says is doing very well, will grow at 3.4%, Agriculture, half of it is horticulture, pisciculture, floriculture. And because trade and transport stopped, they couldn't come out. So I've given data in the book showing that in the Azadpur Mandi, in the month of April, May, less than half the fruits and vegetables are coming. They were rotting in the fields. And therefore, the government, in the estimate that it has given, has said the targets have been fulfilled, where the targets were not fulfilled. Production was actually declining because it was rotting in the fields.
If I'm understanding you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying actually even the claim
Yes.
that agriculture was doing well
Yes.
and achieving 3.4% levels of growth, that too is disputable.
Absolutely right. And therefore, my estimate is that in the Q1, in April, May, agriculture also declined by at least 20%, because fruits, vegetables, floriculture, etc. is half the production of
If you claim
agriculture.
agriculture declined by 20% in April, May,
Yes.
the only month left of Q1 is June,
Right.
and yet the government's official figure for Q1 is that agriculture grew by
Yes.
3.4%.
Because they have said that whatever the targets were achieved, because they didn't collect the data, as I was saying earlier, and therefore they simply assumed that the targets were fulfilled, whereas we know that fruits, vegetables, flowers couldn't come out, and therefore the decline took place.
So you're saying that actually what happened
Yes.
in April, May, and probably in June, is that fruits and vegetables were produced, but they didn't get to mandis,
Correct.
therefore they rotted
That's right.
on the farms,
Yes.
they didn't get sold.
Yes.
And therefore there was no income for the farmers.
That's right.
So what, in your estimation, was the performance of agriculture in Q1? The government says it grew by 3.4%. You believe in April and May it shrank by 20%.
Yes.
So for Q1 as a whole, what happened to agriculture?
Must have declined by at least 10%. And eggs, because
This is very important.
Yeah.
You believe that in Q1 agriculture declined by at least 10%.
10%.
It didn't grow by 3.4%.
No, it didn't grow by 3.4%. Eggs, because they are used in midday meal scheme closed down, so 1 crore eggs that are sold there were not produced. Chicken was culled, milk demand went down because sweet shops closed, restaurants closed, hotels closed, marriages didn't take place, so demand for milk also went down. If you go like that, you find at least 10% decline.
So you're saying right across agriculture,
yes,
fruits, vegetables, poultry, milk,
Yes.
they all declined.
that's right. Yeah.
Would that also be true of the Rabi crop?
No. So then it started recovering because you can do agriculture in open areas. But I'm saying the Q1 data is incorrect. From Q2 onward, when you had the unlock, then it could work properly.
And so when you say the economy as a whole for the year has shrunk by 29%, or the breakup being it shrank by 50% in Q1 and 25% in Q2, one component of that shrinkage
Yes.
is your belief that agriculture in Q1
Yes.
shrank by 10%.
That's right.
It didn't grow by
No.
3.4.
That's right.
Okay. Now, in fact, your analysis of the problem goes one step further. You say even after the lockdown has started to be eased, the problem has continued and may even have got worse. Again, I'm going to quote you. As the lockdown was eased, more of the organized sector was able to restart business, but not the unorganized sector.
Correct.
So this disjuncture
Yes.
between organized and unorganized continued
Absolutely.
after the easing of the lockdown. It
That's
may even
right.
have got worse at some point.
Yes. And the Azim Premji recent data shows that at least 20% of the people who lost employment from the unorganized sector have not found, even now, in the month of November, December. So, the unorganized sector, which is 94% of the employment, completely shut down in that period of April, May, and its revival is difficult because demand is not reviving. And whatever demand is there is going to the organized sector. And therefore, the unorganized sector is the one that's finding difficult to revive, And that's why my argument.
So far, we've discussed in considerable detail why you believe the economy as a whole for the year ending 31st March will have shrunk by 29%, not 7.7 as the government
Right.
claims. We've also discussed in the process why you believe Q1 shrank by 50%,
Right.
not 23.9.
Yes.
Q2 shrank, you believe, by 25%,
Yes.
not 7.5 or 7.6.
Right.
And why agriculture, in Q1 at least,
Yes.
shrank by 10%, didn't grow by 3.4.
Correct.
And you also believe that the disjuncture between the unorganized sector and the organized sector, which is the main reason why you believe the
Yes.
economy has shrunk a lot more
Yes.
than the government accepts or admits,
Right.
that disjuncture is continuing to be worse or even getting further worse even after the lockdown has eased.
Absolutely.
So the problem is continuing.
Yes. And the reason it's continuing is because of the great uncertainty, in spite of the vaccination having started, many services are not able to revive. So apart from the unorganized sector declining, even many services are not going to revive soon. And we know that hotels, restaurants, transportation, tourism, they're not reviving.
And services are pretty close to 60% of the Indian economy.
55% of the economy, and that's still down by at least 10%.
Let's then throw into this mix what is happening to, or what has happened rather, to employment.
Yes.
94% of Indian people are employed in the unorganized
Correct.
sector.
Yes.
Many of them, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of
Yes.
millions, have lost their jobs.
Yes.
The CMIE says that as of December, 14.7 million jobs had been lost.
Correct.
Private surveys separately say the loss could be 18 million.
Yes.
The CMIE also says that the unemployment figure for the month of December was 9.1%.
Yes.
And separately we know that 10 crore people availed of NREGA by up to the 10th of Jan, which is 21% above last year.
Correct.
So employment or loss of jobs and therefore loss of income is a huge problem.
Absolutely.
That also means loss of demand,
Yes.
loss of consumption.
Correct.
How much worse is that going to make the situation in the months rolling out?
So, I distinguish in the book between employment and work. My factory is not working, so I'm employed but not working. I'm a government servant, I get my salary, so I'm employed, but I'm not going to office. So work dropped by much more than employment. And that's why the decline in the GDP is much sharper. That's the one point that's important.
But if work drops by more than employment, does that mean that people are not working but still getting paid?
Yes.
Because if they're still getting paid, they're spending and demand is happening,
Yes.
consumption is happening.
But many of them also lost the salary. April salary came for some people, for most people, April salary also went. And the estimate of CMI is 122 million people lost employment, but my estimate is 200 million people were not working.
And when you say 200 million weren't working, are you saying they weren't getting salaries either?
Many of them were not getting salary. We don't have an estimate.
What's the number of people who weren't getting salaries? Because actually, loss of
we don't have
salary
an
is what
estimate.
counts.
We don't have an estimate.
Any
of that.
idea?
No, we don't have an estimate, so I wouldn't make a guess. But what the impression that one has is from CMI itself that 17.5 million people in the organized sector also lost work, and they probably lost income. 5 million professionals lost work, and they also lost, and they are the ones who are the big consumers.
So just to tie up, you're saying that whilst the CMIE says something like, forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, 20 million people lost their jobs. Was that the figure?
122 million people lost employment, and of that, 17.5 million people are from the organized sector,
Right.
and 5 million from the professionals.
So whilst the CMIE says that around 122 million people lost their jobs, of which 17 million were from the organized sector, you're saying that 200 million people lost work.
Yes.
But you don't know how many of them lost salary.
Yes.
And actually, I should point out to the audience, it's loss of salary that's more important, because when you lose salary, you can't spend. Losing work simply means you're not working, you're not earning the salary.
But your GDP goes down if you're not working, because it's work which gives GDP.
I understand. GDP may go down, but as long as you're getting your salary, you can spend, you can
Yes.
create demand, you can consume,
Right.
and that keeps the GDP rising at another level.
Yes. Yes.
You don't have any sense of how many people lost salary.
That's
but
right.
do you believe it's more than the CMIE figure?
Yes.
So it's more than 122 million?
Yes.
For sure.
Yes. So
Is that a hunch, or do you have any basis for it?
So, I went again sector by sector, how many people are in agriculture, how many people are in non-agriculture, and then I calculated that roughly 200 million people lost a work.
Yeah, but what number do you think lost salary?
That we
But
can,
you still
without a
think-
survey, we cannot.
But you're saying it's more than the CMIE's figure of
Yes,
120.
yes. So Azim
But when
Premji-
are you saying yes?
Yes. So Azim Premji university did a survey where they said that 70% could not afford even 1 week of supplies. Which means that 70% of the people who lost work, were not able to buy even 1 week of supplies because their income went
That's
down.
70% of 200 million,
Yes,
according to you.
Yes. So I won't stand by that, but that's one indication
But
of how
hang
many.
on, 70% of 200 million is roughly 125.
140 million.
140 million. So it's about 15-20 million more than the CMIE figure.
CMI figure says that they lost employment, but we don't know how many lost income.
But if they lost employment, they lost income as well. It goes together. You don't get an income if you got employment.
I agree, but we won't make that such a strong statement.
But you still believe, and this is the critical point, that the number of people who lost salary
Yes.
is more than the CMIE figure of 120 million. You
Yes.
still believe that?
Yes.
The only thing is you can't say how much more.
Yes, we can't say that.
Okay.
And also under MGNREGS, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, people are still getting only 45 days of work, not 100 days of work. Okay.
So in other words, the income they are getting is a lot less than they should,
Yes,
which
that's
means
right.
their demand and consumption is suppressed,
Yes.
which also will have an impact on the economy as it rolls out.
Absolutely.
But coming to the end of this interview, you've been extremely brave. You've stuck your neck out. You've put your reputation on the line. Let me tell you, the government is bound to come back and say that Arun Kumar doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking utter nonsense. And I wouldn't be surprised if they actually use language a lot stronger than I have. How would you respond to the claim that this is utter nonsense, which you've cooked up because you're trying to present a case, A, because you don't like the government, or B, because you think it's the best way of attracting attention to yourself?
No, so I go by facts, and that's why I keep pointing to what facts are, whether from the PIB, whether from the CMIE or other things. And in my book, 1/3 of the book is data. So I'm quoting data, official data, unofficial data, people who have done work.
So you're saying your conclusion, the economy has shrunk by 29%, is entirely factually based?
Yes, so it's based on the available data, government and non-government. I'm putting all that together, and as a physicist, I believe I must tell the truth, and not sort of play around. Many of my friends tell me, "Why don't you moderate?" And I say, "Why should I moderate? I'm only looking at facts. I have to be realistic."
So if the government were to challenge you, you can hit them back with facts to prove that your claim the economy is shrinking by 29% is factually based.
Yes, and I've kept asking the government, where is your independent unorganized sector data?
And they haven't replied.
They haven't replied.
Then let me ask you this. If the economy is going to shrink by 29% this financial year ending the 31st of March 2021, what will be the size of the fiscal deficit on the 31st of March?
So my estimate is, given that there were problems in the earlier budget itself, off-balance sheet items were not there, states were not included. So already it was running at about 15% of GDP, of the lower GDP.
When you say 15%, is that the central government thing?
No,
or
together.
Central and states?
Center, states and off-balance items are running already at 15%.
What the British call the public sector borrowing requirement.
Public sector requirement.
Which also includes PSUs.
That's right.
So it was already 15% when the financial year began.
Yes, because the GDP is going to be lower, whereas everybody else has calculated 200 lakh crore. I'm calculating at the lower GDP, and that's why the figure is higher.
So what will it be if it was already 15%?
Yes.
And I'm just repeating for the audience, 15% is the central deficit, the state's deficits, and the public sector units deficit, what the British call the public sector borrowing requirement.
Correct.
If it was already 15%, when the financial year began, what will it be when it ends on the 31st of March?
So now the tax collection is down. Now they've cut back expenditures. So it's already going above 20%, and that's why for December month, you already have more than 150% of the annual target for the fiscal deficit for the center alone. And for the states also, it's already climbed to about 5%. So if you include all that, it'll be above 20%.
So the PSBR,
Yes.
the central deficit, the state's deficit, and the public sector units deficit all combined
Yes.
on the 31st of March this year
Yes.
will be above 20%.
20%, yeah.
When you say above 20%, how much above?
That, remains to be seen, because petroleum has done, they've increased taxes there, so they've got an extra amount there. And when the figures come out in the budget, we'll know exactly how much more.
But you're absolutely sure it will be above 20% for all three combined?
Yes.
What will it be for the central government alone?
For the central government alone, I would suspect it would be at least 15%,
At least?
At least 15%.
I'm just repeating it because
Yes.
these are almost astonishing.
Yes.
This is almost as astonishing as your claim that the economy will shrink by 29% over the year as a whole. You're saying on the 31st of March, that is roughly 2 months from now, the central government's fiscal deficit will be above 15%.
Yes, correct.
And the fiscal deficit combined for the central government, the state governments and PSUs will be above 20%.
Yes, because for the center, I'm also taking the off-balance items like what the Food Corporation, etc., is doing.
Sure. All combined.
All combined.
Above
But
20%.
Yes, above 20%, and for the central government, I'm combining the FCI, etc., also, so above 15%.
My last question. When, in your estimation, will we get back to pre-COVID levels of growth?
No, so there are two things, level of GDP and level of growth.
When will we get back to GDP levels?
GDP level, if there's no second wave or third wave, if the vaccination proceeds well, by the end of this year, we'll get back to where we were in 2019.
By the end of this year?
Yes.
Meaning,
level.
when you say this calendar year or this financial year?
This calendar year, we should, because if vaccination takes place in the next 6-7 months, services sector begin to expand, then we'll get back to the 2019 December by this December.
This is very interesting. You're saying by December 2021,
yes,
the GDP will go back to pre-COVID levels.
To the 2019 December level, okay? The growth rate will not go back to what it was in 2019, because that will take some time, and that may take another 6 to 8 months.
So the growth rate will go back to pre-COVID levels 6 to 8 months after December 2021, which means roughly August 2022.
Yes, mid-2022, yes.
I have to point out here, even the IMF turns around and says, you're being optimistic. Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist of the IMF, in an interview to the Economic Times on the 28th, that is just 2 days ago, says she's not even sure, and mark my words, she's not even sure we'll get back to pre-COVID levels in 2025.
Growth, she means growth.
But you're still saying growth will happen by August 2022, almost 3 years before.
If all goes well in terms of, the COVID-19, the waves and the other things. And what she's saying is that we are projecting mechanically. They don't have independent data. They're not looking at...
Yeah, they're relying on government data.
Not only that, but she's also admitted that we are projecting mechanically.
Absolutely. But nonetheless, the important point is, you have just said to me
yes,
that in GDP terms, we'll get back to pre-COVID levels by December 2021. Yes. And in growth terms, we'll get back to pre-COVID levels by August 2022.
Correct.
Geeta Gopinath is saying that in growth terms, we may not even get back by 2025. In other words, here, you're much more optimistic than she is.
Yes.
Earlier, in terms of the shrinkage of the economy, Q1, Q2, shrinkage of agriculture, you were much more pessimistic than the government. But on this important issue, you're more optimistic than the IMF.
Than the IMF, yeah. But the government says we are going to recover in another 3-4 months. So as compared to the government, I'm not that optimistic,
My last question. Yesterday, the chief economic advisor insisted repeatedly that we were on a V-shaped recovery.
Right.
Montek Ahluwalia a few days ago has said to me, K is the letter he prefers. Which alphabet is your choice?
No, my choice is a shallow recovery, and K means, some sectors are going to do well, like IT sector, telecom, pharma, FMCG, but large number of sectors, especially in services, are not doing well, they're shrinking. So in that sense, people talk about K, but I don't like the term K because actually the economy as a whole is recovering very slowly. So I'm looking at the economy as a whole rather than saying some components are doing this and some components are doing that.
Okay, you don't want to identify an alphabet.
But it's not V. It's not V because V means you drop as sharply and then you rise as sharply, It's not rising that
You give me the impression, right, that in some sense it may be closer to a U in the sense that we've dropped.
Yes.
And as the U takes a sort of
Right.
Dip there, we're in the dip at the bottom.
Yes.
Who knows when the upside will come, but we're certainly at the bottom at the moment.
No. So upturn comes as soon as you start unlocking. It's not that you're going to be remaining there.
But it's a slow
It's
upturn.
a slow upturn. That's what I'm saying. So we call it U or a shallow V or what you like. It's very difficult to capture it.
Professor Arun Kumar, I have to end by saying that there'll be many who've heard this interview who will passionately hope that your forecast that the economy is going to shrink by 29% or that the deficit could rise above 20% is wrong. I don't mean that as an offense to you at all.
No.
It's just that it's such grim news that people hope and pray you're wrong. But thank you for sharing your thoughts with me. Take care.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thanks.